In this video, I want to talk about a bug that came up in class this week, which will be a good way for us to talk about some of the more advanced debugging that you have to do when dealing with other people's libraries, and it'll give us a chance to write some more custom hooks. So let's talk about the bug first. So in our current version of our application, you can use any of the versions, the Electron app or the web app. I'm using the web app version so that I can boot it up without having to think about Electron, and it'll be a little bit easier to see our problem. I'll have a version linked that you can download in the description to have a version that matches what I've got on screen. But once you log into your application, if you go to any of the pages like Add Movie or our movie listing page, and then you refresh the page, you get kicked back to the /account page. So you are redirected away from the URL that you're on, here on /add. We refresh, we are sent over to /account. So what's happening here, if we look at our application code, so you'll download whichever version of the application you want and do your npm install, npm run start to get it running. And then inside of our app, we set up this structure where we had these authenticated routes. So our app, that root level component, was listening to Firebase and listening to the on-auth state change and setting the user here. So we were hoping that our application, when it renders for the first time, that Firebase would have had a chance to figure out its initial authorization state. But what's happening is that our app is rendering before Firebase has a chance for this auth state change to fire, for that Firebase library to initialize itself, look up its cached version of authorization, which means that our app renders initially without being authenticated, because we start off the user as null. We then are not authenticated, the app renders, and then in a second later, or a couple milliseconds later, the Firebase library has finished authorizing, and our handler here gets called, which stores the current user from Firebase. And we could see this if we come into our app and let's console log app is rendering. So log, and let's say the user here. So we're just printing out a message to say that the app is rendering, and then we're printing out the user. And let's also print out a message here that says on auth state changed, triggered. So now we're at our React application. I'm opening up my console window here, and we have logged in. Let me clear this, and I'm going to refresh the page and get it running one more time so that we can see the chain of events here. So it starts off printing app is rendering, and we're seeing our current user is null. And then on auth state changed is triggered later. Our app is rendering again, and now we have our user printing out here. So we're running into a situation where our React app, this app component here, has rendered faster than our Firebase library has initialized. So by the time Firebase has initialized and figured out, is there a current user logged in? Have we saved that? Is that persisted in storage somewhere? Our app is already rendered. So by the time we get here, we've already been redirected to our account page from our authenticated route. So that means we have to figure out some way to, when the application loads, get the current user, but only after Firebase has finished initializing itself. So this is where we would then turn to the documentation. We'd go to the JavaScript reference page for the API. We would look through, oh, here's Firebase auth. Let's check out the overview of this module and see if there's anything that's useful here. So we know that we're using this auth here. And this, just for review purposes, is in our Firebase, where we are calling that auth method from Firebase to get an instance of our auth, which is this interface here. You can see here's how you construct it. So when we're looking at this, we want to see, hey, is there anything here that tells us that our application has been initialized? I see something called current user, and we can see it tells us it's either going to be a user or null. This seems like a good candidate, so maybe we would try bringing that over into our application and see if maybe current user tells us the user before that on-auth state change triggers. So we could come back into our app and we could say console log auth.currentUser here. And then we could cross our fingers and run this and hope that we see null for our initial state and some object here for that current user property. But unfortunately, that seems to be null as well. So our current user property here can't really be trusted. This is only available after the application has, or after Firebase has initialized itself. So that's frustrating. So we could go back up to the top of the documentation here and see, look through the methods. Is there anything that looks like it would tell us when we have initialized? And no, there doesn't look like there's anything. So maybe we could look at the on-auth state changed method and dig a little deeper here and see. This says it adds an observer for changes to our user sign-in state. And this tells us something about the different versions. So in a past version, this was the behavior. In the version we're using, it's telling us this observer is only triggered on sign in or sign out. So on first pass, this on-auth state changed seems to be saying that it's not going to tell us when the application has been initialized. This is often the place where the documentations for a library will break down, and you actually want to dig into the source code to try and figure out, hey, what's really going on here? And luckily for us, this JavaScript library is open source, so we could just look for Firebase JS, the npm package, follow it to its GitHub repository, and here is the source code for this library. So what we would want to do is start digging in. There's a lot of folders and files here, but luckily we can use the search feature built into Google, or we can start clicking around and try to find the particular file that we're looking for. So we know that we're looking for something that has on-auth state change or on-auth state changed. So I could search for on-auth state changed, choose in this repository, and we'll see a couple of different results that are coming up here. We have some markdown files that are the documentation, some test files, some package files, and we could dig through here to see. Nope, nothing yet. Here we go. This last one, in packages auth source. This is the source code of our library here. So unfortunately, I was hoping this search would give us something that didn't require us to figure out the structure of their library. Since Firebase uses a common structure, it was easier for me to find what I was looking for here. So maybe let's go back to the root. And so what I am doing here, if I'm not going to use that search or that search doesn't work, is I'm going to start looking for things that are familiar. So maybe there's source code at the root of the repository. And I don't see any here that would be useful. So then I'm going to look for something like a source folder or a library folder or a packages folder to start looking for the source code. Here's packages, and this is organized by those modules in the application. So I can see this is actually going to be easy to find. Here's my auth folder. And then once I'm in this auth folder, I can see things that are more familiar, like I see an SRC. So I'm going to head into there and see if I can find something that looks like it might have what we're looking for, which I can see my auth.js. So if we think back to our path here, we're in Firebase, we're in the auth module, and now we're looking at this auth interface, this auth object here. So hop into that file. And now that I'm in this file, I can search using Control F for onAuth state change to find the method. And so this is where we have to do a little bit of digging to try and figure out how auth state changed works. And the difference between what we're reading here and what we read, let's see, where is that? Here, is that this is documentation that someone wrote about how the code works, which may or may not be accurate and may or may not have all the information we need. This is literally the code that is running. So if we read this and we understand what this code is doing, then we understand what this method does regardless of how it's documented. Luckily, this function, this method here, seems to be well documented with comments. So if we just take a second to read it, we can sort of understand how this onAuth state changed works. So this first bit is telling us that they're doing a check to see if the state has already been determined. So this is state resolved. So this is some internal property that they keep track of. It's a Boolean to check whether or not the library has finished initializing itself. And it's telling us that this will trigger whatever observer or function has been passed in immediately if we're in that determined state. Or, otherwise, make sure to notify anyone after initialization has been finished. And specifically, it's saying here, we can't trigger this synchronously because this API is supposed to be asynchronous. So they're going to do some things to make sure that it's asynchronous. So if we are already initialized, this logic runs. And this is showing us that it creates a new promise, a promise that resolves immediately. And when it finishes, what it does is run this code here, which this is checking that parameter that's passed in, that function that's passed in. If we look at our docs here, it's this parameter, the kind of observer that we pass in. Same thing in this example. It's the function that you're passing in that gets called anytime the auth state changes. So what this is doing is essentially invoking that function. There's a little bit of a branching logic here based on the fact that this API accepts two different ways of passing in a subscription. We're kind of in this situation here where we're passing in a function. We're not passing in an observer. Or sorry, said that wrong. We're passing in an observer function here. We're not passing in something that has a next property. So we can kind of disregard this part of the branch. So even if we don't understand all of this code from reading it really briefly, what we do understand is that when we call onAuthStateChanged, it is either going to trigger immediately this branch if the user has already been initialized by the time onAuthStateChanged is that listener is set up, or it'll be triggered later when initialize is finished. So we can actually use this to improve our app to make sure that we have the user by the time the application loads, because we know onAuthStateChange will either trigger immediately or after initialization. So this will reliably tell us the user, even if for some reason our app is slower than our Firebase library in terms of initialization. So if Firebase initializes and our app loads, 10 seconds later, we will still get the current user from this onAuthStateChanged function. I would argue that this would be an important thing for the documentation to point out, that this onAuthStateChanged is not just telling you when the auth state changed, but also when you set up that observer for the first time, will give you the current user. It's an important thing to know going into the library. Okay, so what we know is that we can rely on onAuthStateChange to give us that current user. So we can now bring that knowledge back into our code and fix up our app so that we actually have the current user before we render the application. So we're going to give Firebase a second, not literally a second, it's going to be much faster than a second. So a few milliseconds to initialize before we do the rendering of our application. And we're going to do this by creating a custom hook that we'll call useUser. We're going to pass in that auth object, and this hook will use that auth object to figure out what the current user is. Now we're going to write this hook just in line here to start, and then we'll refactor it. We'll move it elsewhere. So we'll move it into our hooks folder after we've got it working. So what we're going to want to do with this is, we know that there's now kind of a loading state associated with our user. So let's create isLoading, set isLoading equal to useState, and we're going to start it off in that loading state because we don't have a user when this hook runs for the first time. Then we'll create a user, set user, piece of state here, we'll start it off as null. We're going to need to do this onAuth state triggering here. So we've got our effect, we've got our onAuth state triggered here that sets the user. The effect runs the unsubscribe that comes from the onAuthStateChange function when we invoke that. And we need to make sure that this useEffect has the auth, this parameter that's passed in as a dependency, to make sure that this reruns if for some reason our authorization object changes while the app is loaded, while this component is mounted. And then we can return is loading and user here. So we'll be able to pull in both of these pieces of information to our application when we use this hook. And the last thing that we need to do here is make sure that, our loading starts off as true. Let's set it to be false when onAuthStateChanged has triggered. So if we think about this hook in terms of our knowledge that we just gained, regardless of when this is called, so you've kind of got to think about two possibilities. Either this hook is loaded after Firebase has loaded, or it's run before Firebase has loaded. I guess I should specifically say before Firebase has initialized. So you want to make sure that your logic works in both of those situations, because we kind of have this race condition where we could be in either situation. Either our app could render first or our Firebase library could initialize first. And because we learned that on-auth state changed is always going to be triggered at least once when you first set up this subscription, so it's always going to be called when the library has initialized, or it'll be triggered immediately if the library has already initialized. We know that by the time this runs, Firebase has initialized and we have our current user. So that works even regardless of which situation we're in. If our code, this user hook has been called before Firebase has initialized, then this listener is set to run sometime in the future after Firebase has initialized, and we'll know that we're no longer loading and we'll have the current user. And in the other situation, our hook is called after Firebase has initialized. We know that on-auth state changed will run immediately, or with a slight delay because it's asynchronous here, and give us that current user as soon as it possibly can. And we'll know that we're done loading. So both of those situations are covered by our hook here. So then what we can do is use this hook down here. So we no longer need to maintain the user state ourselves. We can get our isLoading and user variable from useUser when we pass in our auth object. We can get rid of our subscription here. And what we do need to do is be mindful of if we are loading, we don't actually want to start rendering the application yet. So what we could do is return a loading spinner, or we could return the word loading. This is going to flash for like a millisecond because Firebase doesn't take that long to run its initialization. So actually in this version, I think I'm just going to return null. So our application won't render anything until Firebase has finished its initialization procedure. And then if it has finished, we are in our full application. We know that we have our user if the user exists. So we should be able to go back to our application here. We're logged in. We go to a page like add and refresh. Whoops. Okay, so let's make sure that was supposed to stay on the same page. So let's make sure that we actually saved our files. All right, it looks like everything is saved. So then we would use our debugging toolkit here to console log what's going on. So I'm going to print out isLoading, and I'm going to print out user so we can see what's returned from our hook here. So let's go simulate the issue. We're on one page, we refresh it. We're loading, no user. We're no longer loading, no user. We're no longer loading, user. Okay. So I made a mistake here in the order in which I was doing these. So React isn't guaranteeing us that it's going to do all of these updates in one batch. It's actually running them separately. So after we set isLoading false here, that triggers our app to re-render. Then set user is set to the current user and our app re-renders, which is not what we wanted. There are a couple ways to handle this. One would be that we could flip the order here so that our user is set before we set is loading, which should fix this issue. So I'm on add, I refresh the page, I stay on add, because we stay in our loading state for a second longer here for one extra update. We are still loading, but we have our user. We're no longer loading. We have our user. So we're kind of prioritizing which of these gets updated first. This kind of fixes our issue, but it also feels brittle because we had to be aware of the order in which these are updating. So what we could do instead is refactor our state to store an object to store these two pieces of information together. So we could do something like const data set data is use state, and here we will have loading true user null. So we're just binding these two pieces of state into one object here. And then when we run this, instead of two separate updates, we're going to do set data loading false user current user. So we can get rid of these. We can get rid of these. And then when we return, it would still be nice to kind of just return these things in our kind of array syntax so that we can destructure them and name them however we want here. So we will just grab our loading and user from data. So we're just doing object destructuring, which pulls out the values in these properties into these variables. And then we can just return loading user. And maybe for consistency, I should have called this is loading. So let's just make sure that that's the same everywhere. And now we should be able to refresh the page and only have two updates. The first one that says we are loading, and the second one that says we're no longer loading. Here's the user. So we fixed that bug, no redirection. I think I want to add one more thing here. If we look back at the authorization, there are three parameters. There's this first one, which is our listener, that function that we're passing in. There's a second one, which we haven't used before, which tells us if there were any errors. And then there's a third one that tells us when the auth state change has completed. We don't really need that third one, but that error one would be good for us to at least print out to the console so that we as developers knew as we're working on it if something went wrong with our authorization. So what I'm going to do is let's create a new piece of state here, which is our error, set error. And then we know that our on-auth state change takes two functions in, one for when there's a change that's happened to the authorization state, and one when there's an error. So we could kind of just chain two functions in as parameters here, or I think it would be cleaner if we just break these out. So I'm going to say onChange is equal to our first function. So this is just an arrow function, and then we can pass it in here on change. And then we can say const on error equals, and we'll use an arrow function here and pass in our on error. So this function, we can tell from our docs, is taking in an error as a parameter. So I'm going to call that E, so that then on the other side of this function, I can set error to E. And then in our return, we can return an error. if one occurs. So down here, we can get the error that's being returned from our hook. And let's say if there is an error, let's console.error it so that we could see it if one showed up. Because we haven't run into those errors before, our authorization hasn't hit some issue with like losing connectivity mid-check or something else that would cause it to error out. I don't think we're going to see anything here, but we should at least test to make sure that we haven't broken any of our previous logic. So I can still go to one of my URLs, refresh the page, and stay on that URL. So this is looking good. I think it is now time for us to pull this out into its own hook. So let's remove it from app because there's no reason for this to live in our app file. Go into our hooks and create a useUser.js where we're going to grab our app hook that we just created here, useUser, bring it in here. Looking at this code, we use state and we use effect. So we need to bring those in from React. Import those from React, and let's also make sure that we export default useUser. So with this set up, now we should be able to go to app, remove this, and we can now import useUser from our hooks folder, useUser. Give this a save, make sure there are no errors in the console, and make sure that our application still works as expected. Add movie, refresh. I'm still on add movie, all good. And now I could clean some of this up, like I know these are going to cause warnings because we no longer need to use state and use effect directly in our app. And one thing that I want to point out as we've done this, moving this to a hook, is that by virtue of moving this to a hook, we have now created something that is portable that we can move from project to project. Nothing that we have in here is tied to our specific setup in this project. It doesn't care about our collections, our users collection, our movies collection. This is just about authorization in Firebase. So this nice hook could be brought to our next Firebase project and used there to tell us whether a user has logged in. All we have to do is provide that authorization object so that on-auth state change can run. So we've made something more portable, more reusable by moving our logic out of app and into useUser. And in the process, we kind of solved that bug that we were seeing where our application loaded before Firebase initialized. While we're at it, I did notice, as I was about to wrap this up, that we did have in movie some of our database logic in that component. So we might as well, since we're working on refactoring and adding this useUser hook, add a useDeleteMovie hook that handles this logic, because hooks are really useful for pulling this kind of database logic out of our rendering from our components and moving it into a reusable hook that we could bring to multiple components. We might need to delete in multiple places, and if we do, putting that in a hook means that it's more portable. Even if we don't use it in multiple places, it can be useful to take this logic out of our component here so that our component, when we think about it, we don't even have to worry about the details of how the delete movie works. We just know that our hook, we wrote it, we guaranteed that it was working at the time. We don't really have to think much about it. We can just focus on the rendering when we're working on our movie component. So let's create a new hook, useDeleteMovie.js. useDeleteMovie, export default, useDeleteMovie. And then if we go into our movie here, we kind of are going to need all of the state and function here that was related to our deleting. So we had a Boolean property, whether or not we were deleting, that we set to true when we started and set to false if there was an error. We had that error message that we set to blank and then set to something if there was an error message. And then, of course, we had this function deleteMovie that was responsible for actually running the delete. So I'm going to grab all of this and bring it into useDeleteMovie. And we can import, looks like we're going to need useState from React. So we've got our 2 lines here fixed by importing that. Now with our hook, we can just decide what we're going to return. So we definitely want this Boolean for isDeleting. We definitely want the error message. And we also want this deleteMovie function to be exported. So anyone who uses this hook gets these 3 pieces of information. And if we're looking at our hook, we can also see that this requires a user ID and a, let's call this movie ID, to be passed in. So we could define these in 2 places. We could say that those are parameters to this deleteMovie function, or we could say that those are parameters to our hook itself. And for our purposes, it doesn't really matter which we use here. I think we've put them as parameters here in previous hooks. So as a demo, let me put them up here. So now we should no longer get any compile errors. Good. So we're providing our user ID and our movie ID here for our delete. And we should now be set to bring this hook into our movie. So we can blow away all of this that we just refactored into a hook and import our useDeleteMovie from hooks, useDeleteMovie. And now we are going to get those 3 parameters from our array when we call useDeleteMovie and provide in the user ID, which we can see here is a prop, and our movie ID, which is a prop here, so ID. And since I don't remember the order of those parameters that we just set up a second ago, I'm just going to flip back over and grab these from our array and paste them in here. And just emphasizing this again, because of the way array destructuring works, even though they're called isDeleting error message delete movie here, we could change any of the names. This could be delete the movie instead of delete movie. And that destructuring, all it cares about is matching the position of these variables in this destructuring with the position of the values that are in this array. So that's why destructuring, array destructuring is used a lot here, is because it gives you control over setting those parameter names or those variable names. Okay, so we've got isDeleting error message delete movie. It just so happened that those are all the variable names we were using previously. So this code is using isDeleting down here, delete movie down here, and error message here. So we should be good. Just remove some of that white space, and I'm going to reorder this slightly. There we go. I like to put my hooks first above any of my other variables here. So we should be good to go ahead and test this. Oh, nope, one compile error. If we go to delete movie, we're using the users collection, so we need to import that. So import users collection from, that is in data firebase. Okay, so let's add test delete movie here so that we can go to all movies, give it a delete, and see that it works. And we should still have our previous bug fixed with our refreshing. So it looks like we're all good. I think maybe the last thing I'll do is, looks like I left this project in a state with a couple of warnings. It's always good to make sure that we check those. Those warnings can indicate that we did something wrong that could lead to a runtime error later. So it's good to fix those. I am going to just run through them one at a time here. Our index.js is importing user collection and not using it. So I'm going to hit Control P, go to index.js. Let's get rid of that. And we don't need this test code anymore. So let's get rid of that. Save this. Our useMovie hook. This is a hook we wrote previously. It's telling me that this useEffect here is missing a dependency. So React has scanned this code to see that user ID is used inside of this effect, but it is not declared here as a dependency, which is not good. Anytime you're using a variable inside of your effect, you do want to declare all of those things that are dependencies, so that this effect will rerun if these variables ever change. So I'm going to come in, pass in the user ID as a dependency in this array. So this is the second parameter here to our useEffect function, or to the useEffect here. So the first one is this function, and then the second one is the array of dependencies. So we'll save that. Looks like I forgot to do that in useAllMovies previously. So same deal, we are using the user ID and we have not declared it as a dependency. So we'll save that. And then it looks like we have a bunch of unused imports. So useState, we're no longer using in movie. Users collection, don't need that. Account info, don't need useEffect here. And then movie form. Looks like we have a unused set error message function from our form that allows us to edit movies. And this, I am going to leave this in here because I may still record a video that shows how to do validation, where we'll actually use this error message to make sure that when someone types in an invalid rating or title or year, we use that error message as a way to display that to the form that something's gone wrong. Okay, so let's zoom back out to wrap this up. We dug pretty deep here to learn how on-auth state changed works because the documentation didn't provide us enough information to figure out what we needed. We were trying to find a way to make sure that we always had the user, regardless of whether Firebase has initialized already or whether it's still waiting to be initialized. And it turns out when we read that code that on-auth state changed, provided that information for us. So we were able to then, create our two new hooks. We have our useUser, which uses the auth state change. And then we just happen to also add the useDeleteMovie to kind of complete our transformation of our code, to take all of our database logic out of our components and move them into reusable hooks. If you're continuing to work on your final project, I do recommend that anytime you're thinking about doing some database logic, so interacting with Firebase, you think about creating that as a separate hook from your component. And it's okay in development to, like if we're making our movie for the first time, to just do all of that coding in the component, because it's easier for us to think through having it all in one place and just getting something running. But once you've got it running, it can be really useful to go through and refactor things out, like we did with our useDeleteMovie. All right, that's all I got for you in this video, so I'll see you in the next one.